back to Sailor's Disgrace. This is episode 7, and I'd like to start this with a quote by Robert Kiyosaki. One of the biggest defects in life is the inability to ask for help. I truly understand that now, and as I began my therapy, it was very difficult to open up to a stranger, to share what I was going through, even though I knew I had to. For me, I had to figure out a way to understand what was going on, why I was reacting to my trauma in the way I was, the manner I was. That it took me 12 years to realize that I needed help and to understand that I shouldn't feel shame or guilt because of that. That now that I'm asking for help, that I can start to heal and that I can't take everything on by myself. I certainly can't ignore what happened to me. I couldn't ignore the way I was treating myself, that I had to face it, that I had to finally confront the traumas in my life, starting with my rape, starting with the most violent and the most damaging single incident in my life. That once I did that and I asked for help, that I was finally able to confront the other issues in my life. And as I said in the last episode, I was on medication and having horrible side effects, and the first rounds of therapy were brutal. Brutal. It was very difficult. But eventually I started to get better. It took some time, but I started to follow the advice from my therapist, and she was great. And this is a little dig at the TRICARE, the medical coverage that we receive. The therapist I was with at first, she was excellent, and then something happened to where TRICARE would no longer accept her. So if I wanted to continue, I would have to pay out of pocket. And I did not have the money for that. As for as much therapy as I was receiving, that probably would have been an extra $1,000 to $2,000 a month. There's no way I could afford that. So I had to restart therapy with a new therapist, and that was challenging in and of itself. I had to regain trust with someone else, and luckily for me, she was also great, and I had an excellent relationship with her. And I started to wean myself off the medication slowly. I reduced my dosage by half, and then another half, and another half, and finally it was getting out of my system, and it was painful. It really did have effects as it was leaving my body. I think I became addicted to it or dependent upon it, and physiologically I could feel it. I could feel the serotonin levels in my body. My brain was wanting it, and I would lose sleep, and I would have like electric shocks going through my brain, and would literally wake me up. It felt like I was sticking my finger in a light socket, and it'd vibrate through my body and wake me up. It was awful. It was really bad. But eventually it passed. Once I finally got it out of my system, and it was my second round of medication. I finally got it out of my system. I started to feel physically. I started to feel a little bit better. I was still attending the therapy and processing, and I was starting to journal more, which was something my therapist recommended, and I'm grateful for that. I was in such a dark place, and I was in so much depression that writing about it helped me understand it. And she also taught me something, to write 3 things that you are grateful for every day. And it can be as simple as having a breath, or I had a good cup of coffee this morning, or I saw a nice sunrise, or I saw what even the most minuscule thing. That my shoes felt comfortable today. Whatever, anything to be grateful for, and to start thinking in that way, to start displaying gratitude for your life, and not to focus on all the negatives that have happened to you in the past, or even how terrible you may feel in the present. That there is gratitude in all those things too, even gratitude for going through trauma in a strange way, because it puts us where we are now. It puts us on that path of healing and understanding and growth, which I didn't get to that point till later, but at first it was just the basic journaling. And um, it reminded me kind of a funny thing. If any of you guys out there remember Stuart Smalley, the Saturday Night Live character, and he would look into the mirror. It was played by Al Franken, and his thing was he'd look into the mirror and say, "I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me." And I always loved that. As a kid, I loved that. And I started writing like that, which is it was a joke, it was an absolute joke on the show, but in real life and practicality, as you're trying to heal through trauma, that's kind of what you have to do. You have to start caring about yourself. You have to start taking care of yourself mentally. You have to really show some self-love. And I didn't see that. Um, I didn't see that at all when I started the process. And I was at a point where I was getting to that point. I was finally starting to feel like, okay, my investigation didn't go anywhere, and that's okay. It's not my fault that I didn't speak out for 12 years. There are different reasons why. I was protecting myself. The reason and this is what my therapist taught me, was when it happened in 2004, I could not speak about it. Not just because of what happened in my family and how I was raised, but it was a self-preservation tactic or technique. I could not comprehend what had happened to me. So it was survival. It was survival to suppress it and to just move on with my life, and to forget what had happened to me, because I couldn't comprehend what had just happened to me. And it took me 12 years to finally come out with it, and that's okay. And everyone's different. Everybody's different. There are people that immediately confront it. There are cases out there where you confront your perpetrator, and then that person gets arrested or faces some kind of justice or is put through a process as well, and that's fantastic for those people. But that wasn't my case. My case was different, and that's okay. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's not something to put blame on myself for. I didn't do that to me. I didn't rape myself. How could I? And I didn't want it. And the people that did it are, quite frankly, monsters. And it's a shame. It's a terrible shame that they, got away for it. At least with my case, maybe they got caught with something else, and maybe it's impacted their lives in different ways, or maybe they're just complete horrible human beings and they have no remorse whatsoever. I don't know that. I may never know that. And it is what it is. But like I said, I was finally getting better. It was about a year's worth of therapy, and I was functioning better. I was off the medication. I was starting to feel good about myself. Not great, but I was good. I wasn't in that deep dark hole anymore. And I was finally able to function at a normal level for the most part. And I was there for my son. And I don't want to speak ill of my ex-wife, but even before this trauma, before coming out, our relationship was in trouble. But I was getting more comfortable with that too. I was just living with it until early in 2018. And I don't want to go into all the details. That's kind of, it could be its own podcast of how this case was handled and how medically what I went through. But in early 2018, in March, I believe it was, I was diagnosed with cancer. I had soft tissue sarcoma, a solitary fibrous tumor in my pelvis. And the location of it specifically is it's about the size of my fist, roughly 4 inches in diameter, lump abutting my rectum and my bladder. Um, and that put me on a whole different kind of spiral. and I'm trying to find the cause of my cancer. And this is something I'd really like to focus on for a minute here is how stress impacts the body. How stress can cause it can manifest itself in different ways and become disease, and that's a fact. There are studies on that. And when I was going through all the treatments and the different doctors, and that's one thing I'm also extremely grateful for. I had fantastic doctors at MD Anderson, which is one of the biggest cancer centers in the world, let alone the U.S. And my team of doctors were phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. I could not say enough about them. And I had different specialists. I had a sarcoma specialist, and a I had a gastroenterologist. I had a urologist because it abutted my seminal vesicles and things like that as well. And I also had a radiation therapist, a radiation specialist. They're all on the same team, and we're trying to, identify the best course of action. I eventually went through radiation treatments for about 6 weeks or so, and then I had a surgery when I had an ostomy bag for a while, and then I had a reversal of that. So I was out of work for probably 7, 8 months, and my command was fantastic for that at least, and they let me take my time off and heal and take care of myself, and that was a different level of shame as well, feeling that I couldn't help out at work, but it's okay, I had to take care of myself first. But when I was going through my medical history with the doctors at MD Anderson, they're trying to identify how possibly this could have formed, and I explained to them my job in Houston. I was around, working in the petrochemical industry on ships every day doing inspections, and they didn't seem too concerned with that. But then I told them about my rape, and that grabbed their attention. Um, I explained everything to them about when it happened and how I had hemorrhoids removed in 2008, and they found warts. And I didn't speak out about it until 2016, and I had a breakdown and all this stuff. So that's what they were into. That's really what got their attention. And I asked about how long could this have been growing inside of me. It's about 4 inches wide or in diameter, and they estimated that it was probably between a year and a year and a half that it started growing. And this is in March of 2018. I first spoke to Shannon in August of 2016. So a little rough math, and that's exactly a year and a half. And it makes perfect sense that what I went through with my PTSD, that immense amount of stress and depression, manifested itself outside of my rectum, and which is also where the trauma physically occurred, and had untreated hemorrhoids and warts from 10 years prior to that, and it all manifested itself into a cancer, which at the time, of course, I'm going through that trauma, and I'm dealing with trying to battle cancer and being sick and tired from the radiation, and then there's so much to unpack with the cancer itself. I did not know if I would have a job, because if I was going to be medically unfit for service, due to depending on the extent of the surgery, and they didn't know until the day of the surgery if I would even have a rectum after I woke up, and if I would live with an ileostomy for the rest of my life. Luckily, it was only a temporary thing because they were able to get it out without destroying my insides. And again, I attribute that to the excellent medical care at the MD Anderson and the folks that took care of me. Had I been somewhere else, who knows? And again, I don't want to get into that story, but I'm grateful for where I wound up, and that's due to a lot of different factors. But it was eye-opening to see how stress can manifest itself, how stress can affect you physically, not just mentally, but it can kill you. And had I not been checked when I was for the cancer, it could have grown worse, and a lot of things could have happened. But I'm very fortunate that in the long run it worked out, and I've been cancer free since 2018. Just a side note there, I had my 5-year checkup recently, and I'm clear. I still have to get CAT scans for the rest of my life just because of the type of cancer, but I don't care about that. That's easy. I can lie down on a table for 15 minutes once every year or two. It's okay. And I have the strength now to where if it came back, I know I can handle it better. But that that is just something to be aware of for anybody listening out there. That stress, any kind of stress, not just PTSD, but stress is a killer. It causes so many health issues, and I'm very fortunate to have made it through that battle as well, on top of my PTSD. And I attribute a lot of that to, again, my command in Houston was excellent and really wanted to take care of me and understood what I needed to do. And I'm so grateful to have had that. And that I did have medical care that was worldwide renowned, and that I didn't have to pay for it. That my medical insurance, in this case, covered it. And that, again, that could be a whole different episode or a whole podcast on itself. But I remember being in the waiting rooms, and I was there for months doing radiation and all that stuff and talking to people. And I ran into so many people that were on doing second mortgages on their house and going bankrupt just to pay for treatments and surgeries and appointments. And it's sad. That's a sad state of affairs for many. So I did not have that stressor. Thank God I did not have that stressor. I just went through it physically and emotionally, but financially I was okay, and I was able to keep my job, which was a lifesaver in the long run. So I went through all that as well, and I got through the cancer. I did it, and I continued my therapy. And around that same time, and I think it was actually before my cancer, I should have mentioned it, but I started a group therapy as well, and this was a recommendation from my therapist once I was ready for it. And it was a group therapy session. I think it was twice a week for a while at night. And I vividly remember my first session. I think there were 5 or 6 of us in the room at first, and then as the weeks went on, people would drop off and stop coming. And at the end, there was just 3 of us, and we became pretty good friends, and we still text message and keep in touch to this day. But that very first meeting, I remember going in there, and we just introduced ourselves. We didn't say anything about our traumas. We just introduced ourselves, and I think a few people mentioned a little bit. We were just feeling each other out. We all had this terrified look. We all looked like we were just mortified to be in that room, and that we might be speaking about what had happened to us. We all had different types of trauma, some sexual, some medical, some other kinds of trauma. And I remember I didn't say anything about my trauma at all. I just said who I was, and I'm glad to be there. And the therapist that was leading the group sessions read from a book and gave us workbooks to work through for complex PTSD. And it was a 2-story building and a small parking lot outside. And by the time we got out, it was dark. It was maybe 8:30, 9 o'clock at night. So we're the last people there. And like I said, there's only 5 or 6 of us plus the therapist. And I walk out to the parking lot, and it was in an L shape around the building. And I could not find my truck. I was so lost. I was so disassociated with reality just from being so scared in that room that when I left the building, I couldn't remember where I mean, there's only maybe a couple 100 feet to look for my truck, but I could not find it. I walked in a circle, and I was afraid to ask anybody for help, and everyone else went to their vehicles and moved on. I eventually found it, of course. It was just around the corner from where I was standing, but I walked in big circles through the parking lot, and I couldn't focus. I couldn't think. I can't even remember how to get home from there. I know it's not too far from my house. And that's how that therapy started. And like with all the other therapy and all the other tools I started learning at first, they're almost impossible to grasp. You don't think you can do it. You don't have the strength. You don't want to face it. You don't want to say it. You don't want to you were so good at burying it for so long, and now it's all out, and it's just killing you. It's just tearing you down. But it got easier every time I went back, and eventually I got to a point after a few meetings where I opened up about what happened to me. And that was the first time I said it in a group setting. Of course, I said it to my therapist and to the Coast Guard investigators and my sister and my ex-wife. But that was the first time I said it to a group of strangers, really. I mean, we kind of knew who we were by then, but I didn't really know these people. And when I said it then, it was terrifying, but not as terrifying as it was before. It lost some of its power. And I was finally able to say it in a group setting. And I could feel it. I could feel that slipping away. I could feel that hold that it had on me just kind of starting to loosen a little bit at a time. And I kept doing it, and I would listen to other stories, and it wasn't a compare and contrast thing, but it was just a sharing in the healing. That's what it really was, that we were able to communicate with each other and give each other encouragement. And while you're giving someone else encouragement, you realize that you're talking to yourself at the same time, that you're actually giving yourself advice, things that you're reading in the books. And I'll mention these books later on and put links to the different ones that I work through. But you realize that you're internalizing what you're reading by saying it out loud, by giving it to someone else. And they do the same thing. And then before you know it, you start to build up a relationship. You build that trust. And you're starting to take that power away from your trauma. You're starting to move through all of it. And I say this a lot to people, is that you never get over a trauma. You never get over anything. You get through it. You have to work through these things to get to the other side, to finally put it in its proper place. And I was finally doing that with the group therapy. And it was happening. It was finally happening. And I was just getting to that point, and then going through the cancer and my marriage falling apart, all even worse, even faster now because of all that. And again, I don't want to speak ill of my ex-wife, and she's the mother of my son, but things were not very well at all for her, aside from my issues, and it just kept steamrolling, but I started to see the benefit of what I had done, the benefit of speaking out finally, of confronting what had happened and putting in the work to feel human, to feel like I was worth it, and to accept that life goes on, life carries on, and that we are worth fighting for, for each other as well, and showing that compassion and empathy for others helps you as well. So that's, I think, where I'd like to end this episode. And we're getting close, folks. We're getting close to the end of my story. Well, not end of my story, but to modern day Julian and where I am. We're almost there, and there's a few more things I'd like to talk about, and the healing process. And it goes on forever, of course. We're never fully actualized or healed. I believe there's always room for growth and improvement, no matter who you are. But again, a quick plug to David Brown of Wayward Blues. Thank you again so much for the theme music. I feel it fits so well with what we discuss and really sets the tone, which is somber but also reflective and thoughtful. So thank you, David, for that. Check him out on Spotify and on his website. Links are below. And as always, folks, I really appreciate you tuning in. Please drop a comment, send me a message. If you have any questions or ideas for the group or for the podcast, I'm all ears. And I just want to say thank you to those that have reached out to me. I really appreciate the feedback. It helps a lot. So once again, folks, thanks again, and take care of yourselves.
been down since I was born. Think I'll have the